Welcome to my presentation of my evidence for Teaching Standard 8, where I'll be looking at the wider responsibilities of a teacher with a specific reference to taking responsibility for improving my teaching through appropriate professional development and being able to act on feedback from my colleagues and mentors. So in terms of the starting point for this teaching standard, this was based on a lesson feedback from both my mentor and university mentor and school-based mentor in terms of a lesson I delivered, which was a lot more disjointed than I'd have liked, despite the fact that I felt like my subject knowledge within the specific sport was pretty good. The reality was that the assessments that I used within the lesson were a bit disjointed. My considerations for space involved in the lesson was pretty poor, and overall pupils probably weren't aware of what success looked like for them in the context of that lesson. So reflecting on the lesson, I felt like my main issues were my poor organisation of space, the fact that I didn't make my learning outcomes explicit enough, that pupils weren't aware of what success looked like within the context of the lesson, and therefore I sought to address these key issues by having discussions with other teachers, making notes based on after school clubs, and trying to think more clearly about how to link the activities I was delivering in with the assessments and the questions that I was using within my lessons, and how well I was managing this process. So a key quote here from the book Teaching Secondary School Physical Education is that connections made with an intended learning objectives and assessment outcomes in previous lessons can help facilitate progressive learning and allow for more meaningful differentiation from the start of the lesson. So by going away and working on these key factors, I hope to be able to facilitate this learning and also give myself a starting point for differentiation. So following this lesson, what I went away and did was attended or observed and shadowed an after-school club, and I took notes on key themes I felt were being developed in these after-school clubs, how they might fit in with future lessons that I was going to deliver, some easier and harder variations of the task, and how I could develop an assessment process that aligned with what I was seeing. So for example, the after school club that I observed was some rugby sessions, and from here you can see how I've built a framework of key themes, activities that match up with the key themes, ways of making these activities harder or easier, and how an assessment would align with these activities. So what I was hoping to do here was make it a lot more seamless as to the assessments, the progressions, the regressions, and the lesson themes all seeming like a coherent and a flowing example to help make my lessons more fluid, rather than what felt like a bit of a reactive use of assessment or use of questioning in the lesson that I was initially observed in. Another thing that I went away and had a little look at from a research standpoint was the use of questioning. So in looking up questioning, I found that there were higher and lower order questions, and therefore these questions may be more or less appropriate for pupils dependent on either their cognitive ability or what they have physically demonstrated within the lesson. So following this, I went and developed a questioning matrix, which allowed me to map out a load of questions which were relevant to the scheme of work that I was basing some of my lessons on. And I then mapped out questions for higher ability pupils and questions which may be more appropriate for lower ability pupils. And by using these question stems, I could then target my questions more specifically and in advance, rather than using these questions reactively, which is what I would or what I was doing previously. So in terms of what that looks like in in practice. So I've separated the lesson, this lesson here, into highlighted sections. The purple highlighted sections are explicit success criteria that I wanted students to be aware of within the lesson. The yellow criteria relates to assessment, and the green criteria specifically relates to my questioning within the lesson. So what you can see at the start is how the so this lesson was on defensive lines within rugby. So me specifically saying what I would see if pupils were successful, how this relates into what we've done previously, and how this relates into the backdrop of the principles of rugby. So, for example, using a video within my introduction to the lesson theme, using introducing the lesson theme of defensive lines within the context of previous lessons. So, for example, in the previous lesson, we worked on providing options for the player on the ball, and now we're starting to limit our opponent's options when they were on the ball. So hopefully they could link in what they'd learned previously, and hopefully this would seem like it flowed better by providing them previous context. So you can also see within this lesson plan that I plan to ask questions of lower ability pupils. So for example, considering our lesson theme is defensive lines, what do you think I want to see in this game? And you should also be able to see what questions I plan to ask of a higher ability pupil. So for example, what things do you think your team would need to do to ensure they maintain their defensive line once we've moved on to a more advanced game where players weren't linking with their hands. So what I felt like this allowed me to do, I felt like it allowed pupils to better understand what I was asking of them, why the questions were specifically linked to pupils based on their ability rather than me simply asking whichever pupil had their hand up. And hopefully this allowed for what I believe were better learning outcomes. So for me, the impact that this had on my pupils is evident from my pupil tracker. In particular, I've highlighted one pupil who attended the after-school rugby club that I observed, and you can see how in the latter lessons his performance and attainment were much better than what they were in previous lessons. Now, they weren't bad in previous lessons. You can still see he was achieving silver and was quite well behaved in these lessons. But you can certainly see what I hope looks like a difference in the latter lessons, where I was starting to target my questions a bit more specifically, and I was starting to consider pupils' responsibilities within their team. So for example, within the lesson plan I've just shown, I determined my teams in advance, which not only helped with the flow of the lesson, but also allowed me to delegate a specific working space for each team and to be able to better understand whether pupils were working within their prescribed space or not, which also helped from a behaviour management standpoint as well. So in terms of my lesson feedback that I received for the lesson plan that I just mentioned, the positives include that I was able to have a better frame of reference for checking if pupils understood. Where pupils weren't meeting where pupils weren't focusing, for example, I then used the learning objectives as a frame of reference in terms of getting them back on side. I'd clearly used higher and lower order questions, which my mentor recognised, and I also used various time points within the lesson to check what students had achieved in relation to the learning outcomes. So overall, I felt like I'd acted on feedback that I was given from my mentor. I felt like I have demonstrated my ability to upskill my teaching and respond to this feedback, and I feel like I've demonstrated a better understanding of how to organise space within my lesson, which I identified as a previous issue. Using the grid system in the rugby lesson, I felt like I better communicated the purpose behind the questions I was asking in light of the learning objectives, and I feel like my pupils were more explicitly aware of what I expected from them and what constituted effective learning for them within the context of the lesson.